for those who are not members. So we exist for the larger community. This is what we do. This is who we are. So we are really excited that we could have something that would draw people in and be of interest. All right. We had a little system where I was going to text, and then he was going to text back. And we're really grateful. Oh, audio good. Okay, here we are. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg and our panel.
Thank you, Father Seth. So it's very exciting that you're all here this morning, you who are live and in person, and you who are live streaming. So it's great to have you both here. So welcome to today's forum on how should we teach American history in 2022. This forum is sponsored by the Beloved Community Team. That's the group at Christ Church that seeks racial healing and provides information about racial and social justice issues. The question of what to teach our children has once again become a contentious issue. Back in the 1920s, not that I remember this personally, the controversy was over evolution. You probably heard of the Scopes monkey trial. John T. Scopes was a high school teacher accused of violating a Tennessee law against teaching human evolution in a state-funded school. Then, as now, the controversy has pitted teachers and school administrators and parents and legislators against each other. According to a February article in the New York Times, quote, since January 2021, according to a list compiled by the publication Education Week, 37 states have introduced measures to limit how race and discrimination can be taught in public school classrooms. And 14 have imposed laws or rules to enforce these restrictions. So, many people are asking, what from American history should our teachers teach about our racial history? Only the positive things of our past, or should young people learn about the conflicts and the dark sides of our past as well? The questions for us this morning are, what is being taught, what has been taught, and where shall we go from here? Our panelists include Mark Hilgendorf, who taught American and African American history at Milton Academy, a private school in Boston, for 30 years. He now teaches adult courses in American and African history, focusing on books by American historians. Our second panelist is Scott Williams, who teaches American history at the Whitefish Bay Middle School. He has developed a civil rights unit in his current course. He formerly taught American history at the Whitefish Bay High School. And Jim Benton was a professor of historical sociology at St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin, for 30 years. He was also Dean of Social Science. Jim was in regular discussions of the issue this panel will discuss and present this morning. So there'll be time for questions and answers after all of our presenters have given their talks. So please welcome our three panelists. And yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Greg Bell. I'm a member of Christ Church. So yes, hello everybody. So sorry about that, thank you. Minor thing. So gentlemen, if there is anything more you want to say about yourselves when you present, please feel free to do that. And we'll begin with Mark.
terminology that Greg is known for.
No. There are other.
It's like
others.
a boutonniere.
I know how to
Yeah.
pin it on him.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks, Greg. Okay. No, I'm glad you asked Greg's name because he's done all the organization, all the behind-the-scenes work. Yes. Well, you probably don't know this, but you all have something in common, and I'm taking a risk. Raise your hand if you never took American history in high school. Okay, we've got some internationalists. I'm sorry to be so parochial, but most of you in this gathering have taken American history. And I want to talk about the context of how American history was probably taught when you were in school. And the younger members of the audience, I hope, didn't have this experience. But I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to read the book 1619, which I know many of you are familiar with. This is the book that came out of the New York Times magazine piece. And the author, Nicole Jones, writes about her experience taking American history, and I think it's instructive. Black people, however, were largely absent from the history that I read. The vision of the past that I absorbed from school textbooks, television, local museums, depicted a world, perhaps a wishful one, where black people did not really exist. The history rendered black Americans, black people on all the earth, inconsequential at best, invisible at worst. We appeared only where unavoidable slavery was mentioned briefly in the chapter on this nation's most deadly war. And then black people disappeared, again for a full century, until magically reappearing as Martin Luther King gave a speech about a dream. The quantum leap served to wrap the black experience up in a few paragraphs and a tidy bow, never really explaining why, 100 years after the abolition of slavery, King had to lead a march on Washington. We were not actors. We were acted upon. We are not contributors, just recipients. White people enslaved us, and white people freed us. Black people would choose either to take advantage of their newly won freedom or squander it, as our depictions in the needs suggested we did the squandering. So that's her experience. She grew up in the middle of Iowa, and as a black woman, is writing this book to correct. This is not a book that's angry. It's not a book that wants to polemicize, demonize. It wants to supplement and complement the history that she never learned. So that's where she's coming from. And I don't know how much you know about this book. Glenn Youngkin, who was elected governor in Virginia, he said, one of the first things I'll do as governor is ban this book. That's the first thing I'm going to do. And the second thing I'm going to do is make sure that critical race theory is never taught. Well, I won't go into depth about critical race theory, but many of you probably know as much as I do. It was a third-year law course, an elective, that Derek Bell fathered this course, and it was to look and examine at race as it plays out in institutions like the legal institution and our health institutions. That's what it was designed for, to help third-year law students understand the dynamics of race in a field that they're entering as lawyers. Banned in Virginia, and many, many states are banning this book. So that's a whole nother discussion. But I've read the book. It is powerful and inspirational, but I'm not totally surprised, because when I look at our history, for the first 200 years of our history, 200 years until the 1960s, our history was for white people to support their experiences. Think about your past. Think about what history you studied. The American Revolution was about a scrappy group of colonists who took on the British Empire, and they defeated an empire that was denying them freedom. Sounds like Mr. Zelensky, doesn't it? Fighting for freedom, keeping your land. Well, I never was taught that there were 5,000 black soldiers fighting on the American Revolutionary side and another 5,000 fighting on the British. And I certainly was never taught that slavery was part of the organization of the Constitution, that there were 3 protections in our Constitution for slavery, and that Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800 largely because of the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. That gave South Carolina and other southern states, blacks counted 5 to whites counted 3 people, and that enabled these electoral colleges to grow. So Jefferson probably would have lost to John Adams, the Northerner, but for the 3/5 clause, he is now president. And I'm sure you know much about his slaveholding past. And our author here suggests the largest contradiction at the time of the American Revolution was the Declaration of Independence. We are still responding to a contentious document that claimed that all people were equal as it sat on slavery. Slavery and freedom were joined at the hip. And that's the history that needs to be untangled and unpacked. And we can't lose sight of the need. I think all of you in this room might need a myth. You might need something that inspires you. And I think there's a great fear if we get rid of the whites only myth, we will have no inspiration in our history. We will simply be stuck. I had a professor in college who said there's 2 kinds of history. There's the feel-good history, all the good things we did, and there's the feel-bad history, all the dark sides of history. And I would argue there's a third way. A dualistic way of thinking about our past is dangerous. It wasn't all good and it wasn't all bad. But a non-dualistic view of history would say there's paradox, there's ambiguity. There are stories that are very complicated. I didn't get that kind of history, where I really could think and debate. I went to Whitefish Bay High School, and when we got to Reconstruction, my history teacher taught me that blacks couldn't handle freedom. There were 16 blacks who were in Congress. I don't know if you know this. 2 black senators. And my history teacher at Whitefish Bay said, oh, they put their feet on the table, they were eating chicken, and they were just unruly. They couldn't possibly be free and be in a democracy. That legacy of 12 years of black involvement in our history is the first civil rights movement. Laws were passed. Does everyone know when the 15th Amendment was passed? Steve.
1870.
He's a history teacher. So, who let him in? He's probably going to be critiquing me. But blacks waited 70, 80 years to get the right to vote again in the civil rights movement. My students at Milton didn't know that. They thought I was saying 1970. No, in 1870, blacks got the right to vote. Reconstruction is really the first multicultural, multi-ethnic experiment in our history. And what's so painful is that for 80 years we said no to that vision. We had Jim Crow laws, we had lynching, you know this history, grandfather clauses, poll taxes. But in 1870, this country was coming alive and saying, we're going to embrace a multicultural world. It didn't happen. So that's why I say for 200 years we have suppressed and buried this history. 1965 is the history we like to start with. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, open housing. That's the history we want to embrace. And I understand, I do, why conservatives in this country, many Republicans, are very worried that we're going to somehow teach our children something that will make them uncomfortable, psychologically unstable. If we start teaching about lynchings and Jim Crow, what will the children of today be thinking about their country? We can't talk that way. This is a monumental moment, I think, in our history. For 250 years, we have been struggling with this. Historians in academic settings know this history. They know about the Black experience, women's history, Asian American history. I don't have the time to share with you what 30 years of scholarship has done in this field of history. It has been extraordinary in terms of all the research. For example, I could teach a Black history course today and go through every decade starting in 1760, even earlier, 1619, and I would not be at a loss for material. Every single decade, we have the facts, the journals, the diaries, all of that literature is available. Will it get into high schools today? Probably not. Much of that history. I taught at St. Marcus School for 2 years, and this is an all-Black school on Palmer and North Avenue, and in their book, the U.S. history course, this was for 8th graders, it was a 1995 edition. All of these Black children are learning a whites-only history. Martin Luther King had a sentence in the history book. Slavery had 2 sentences. It was an aberration. Black kids today, down the street, are not learning their history. And it's an incredibly challenging issue, I want to say. But I understand why people are fearful. But I guess I speak from experience. When I taught at Milton, African American history, I would have 20% white students and about 80% Black. And in that class, I wish you could be there to see how the white students lost their fears. The racism that they had experienced was a load they couldn't carry any longer. They called it racial fatigue. And we would talk openly. I would have them keep a journal. We would do the readings on Black history, and then they would keep a journal to record their emotional and personal reactions to the reading, to the films, to the guest speakers. And I had never experienced this myself. I felt privileged as a white teacher to see how these Black students could teach the white students from their chair. The dialogue was uniquely different from anything they had before. And there were tears. We talked about suffering, but the Black students, they're 18, 19, needed a safe place to talk about not so much their anger, but their hurt, their pain. And I had white students, it was a self-selected group, who were willing to listen. The first time in their life, an 18-year-old Black student had a white student listening to their heads, their hearts, and it was transformative. Our class met just before lunch, and the Black and white students would go off to lunch together. They socialized on weekends. Many of my former students are majoring in African American history, white and Black. So for those who fear CRT, those who fear integrated history, that healthy dialogue among students, I'm not sure there's any institution, I'll be bold here, in the country that offers this kind of intimate, stimulating, intellectual sharing of ideas than the classroom in America. Certainly, many institutions are very segregated. The church is always challenged to be more integrated. Maybe the military, maybe athletics. But when you get into a history classroom in high school and students can bear their deepest thoughts and feel safe about doing it, I'm inspired. I think if we can get beyond the CRT talk, I think we have a vision right now. The first time in 250 years, we have an opportunity to finally put to rest this racially described history. It's not about black and white. As Martin Luther King said, it's about lightness and darkness. When I teach the civil rights movement, I know many of you are very deep in your Christian faith, but I can't think of a period of history when I teach the civil rights movement, and when Martin Luther King says, you can bomb my house, you can beat me up, you can put me in jail, but I will still love you. I will still love you. The labor movement, the women's movement, very, very critical, very, very important, but I'm not sure any one of our social movements comes as close to the Christian language, I'm going to forgive you for all the wrongs you've done. And if you hear it, when my white and black students heard that, it was so much of a reconciliation for them. We used to have issues on campus where black students were upset with their treatment, racial issues, and after they took Black history, they didn't have that fear, or that anger. I know I'm a history teacher, so I'm promoting my own field, but I think that history classroom was transformative. It sounds so modest, doesn't it? An 18-year-old black student just wants to be heard by a white student and listened to and not judged, but it's powerful. It's powerful when it happens. And I just want to close with a quote that I think summarizes why I'm inspired right now. This is from, does anyone know who William Sloane Coffin is? Okay. Tell me, who is he? Okay. Any other? He was a chaplain at Yale University in the 60s, and he encouraged my brother to go down to Mississippi to help with voting rights. So he has a very personal connection to me. But he would fill the Yale chapel every Sunday morning because he made his Christian walk so politically and socially relevant. He had the ability to just bring in people, and he had a tremendous impact on my brother. Well, he describes patriotism this way, and think about what I've just said about history. There are three kinds of patriots: two bad and one good. The bad ones are the universal lovers, and the loveless critics. I'll read that again. The bad ones are the universal lovers and the loveless critics. Good patriots carry on a lover's quarrel with their country, a reflection of God's lover's quarrel with all the world. I like that. I like that. CRT, this isn't demonizing. This isn't reducing people. This is a lover's quarrel and an emphasis on love. We need healing. And if history classes can heal part of America, then we don't have to worry about democracy losing it. Those moments in history classes can be moments of healing and reconciliation. And we're far from the scrappy white colonists who tried to overthrow the British. I get that. But I think we're at a deeper moment, and we're going to have a deeper love of our past. You heard Judge Jackson. She loves his country. She loves it. And look how she's treated. We've got to do better. We've got to do better. But I was so moved when she said, I love America. I love the Constitution. She knows the history of the Constitution. But she's presently saying right now, we can move forward. So, thank you all. Thank you all. You got it.
Then I need the battery pack. Oh, yeah. Well, everyone's going to be sorry when they mic up a linebacker coach, but they said they need it for the internet. I said I might be loud enough. Yeah. So, yeah, a little further introduction. Because I'm a member of the community and a public school teacher in Whitefish Bay, I think it speaks to the realness of the things that Mr. Hilgendorf talked about. I'm blessed to work in a school district that is supportive of the style of teaching that I was taught with. So Mr. Bremer here was my 9th grade social studies teacher, a huge influence on me. And I think it's really important. I talked with Mr. Hilgendorf before. You know, for me, the study of history at Wisconsin, the reason it grabbed me in right away is because it was being taught holistically. It was being taught about everybody's story was being told. And so it was layered on top of a profound education I'd already received at university school as a student. But I think that it is important for me to say that I'm here out of my own interest, out of my own passion. I am not a spokesperson for Whitefish Bay Schools in any way. I'm saying that, I feel compelled to say that for my administrators because I feel very supported by my administration at Whitefish Bay High School and Whitefish Bay Middle School. But I think it's important that the community hears me say that I'm here speaking of my positions and my views and things I'm passionate about, and I'm blessed to work with people and for people that I think are supportive of some of those same things. So I have some written remarks, but I do want to speak to a couple of things afterwards and then pass the mic. But I wrote this last year. I was asked to respond to a prompt that Bay Bridge presented with me about teaching Black history. And one of the things as a history teacher that's always been interesting to me is this idea that is brought upon us as kids, like there's Black History Month and there's this History Month. And so the idea that it's fragmented when in reality, when you learn it correctly, it's woven together. And it takes time and a lot of reading. And maybe that's why some shy away. But this was my response. And I credit my dad too a lot in this. So it says, I titled it Black History Matters. Is history a compilation of fact or fiction? Facts, of course. Should those facts be scanned through a bias filter to assure they conform to some cultural belief system? Well, isn't bias the very enemy of a factual inquiry? As Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Negro Week, now known as Black History Month, said, quote, "What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world void of national bias, race hate, and religious prejudice," end quote. Dr. Cornel West further expounded the significance of teaching an inclusive history of America. He said, quote, "A fully functional multiracial society cannot be achieved without a sense of history and open, honest dialogue," end quote. Apparently, some Americans believe that any teaching of our nation's history that includes narrative and documentation of slavery, de facto and de jure segregation, and institutional racism somehow undermines a longstanding commitment to American exceptionalism. Isn't that, in fact, a cultural bias filter? Isn't that position, in fact, a testament to the dire need not for just Black history, but for the honest, inclusive history of all Americans? Is the exceptionalism exhibited by a band of American rebels defeating the greatest military power of Europe to win her independence diminished or undermined if the telling of that history includes, in the timeline, a discussion of the institution of American slavery and the important contributions of Black Americans who fought for our freedom? If we celebrate our nation's founding as the first of many exceptional national accomplishments, how and why would an honest and inclusive telling of that history undermine its significance? Certainly, it is difficult to balance Thomas Jefferson's profound genius reflected by contributions to the Declaration of Independence with the fact that he owned more than 600 slaves over his adult lifetime. That said, great man history, and that's in quotation marks, great man history, if it fails to examine the full person, serves only to create greater distance between the students and truth by removing the complexities and imperfections of the cultures and individuals that we study. Dr. West eloquently speaks to the moral imperative of teaching an inclusive history when he said, quote, "The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak," end quote. Dr. West also reminds us that although there is, quote, "a price to pay for speaking the truth, there is a bigger price for living lies," end quote. What is more exceptional in the history of America than the story of intense struggle and sacrifice on the part of Black Americans in order to grow our nation's understanding of liberty and those deserving of it? If there is a place in American history for celebrating manifest destiny and European Americans overcoming incredible hardships to settle the West, how can we simultaneously justify the exclusion of the history of African Americans who risked and lost their lives and their loved ones resisting the institution of slavery? How can we ignore the chronicles of African Americans who committed themselves in significant numbers to the fight against that institution in our nation's Civil War? African American political refugees' attempts to improve their condition in the Great Migration during World War I led to an exceptional period of Black cultural growth, now known as the Harlem Renaissance. It also led to the simultaneous and explosive rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in both northern and southern states across this country. The juxtaposed duality of those two developments is what makes the events so exceptional. There was exceptional growth and there was exceptional suffering. To exclude either in our study of the nation's past is a betrayal of the nation's current students. How can they make sense of the complicated present without an honest assessment of the complications of a shared past? And understand when I say that, like, we are debating what our past is right now. We live in a world people call post-fact. Think about our children. None of us were raised. I was not raised in a world where people debate facts in the now. And we are also debating our past. What firm ground do they have to stand on? When we can't agree on what is truth and fact now, and we can't agree on what our past was. That is no place to try to shape a child's mind. Excuse the interlude. Perhaps most significant to our current political climate is the development of this generation of students' understanding of patriotism. Is it unpatriotic to ask our nation's children to have an unflinching assessment of our factual past, to expose truthfully the historical strengths and frailties of our national conduct? Or is it unpatriotic to collectively bury our heads in the sand and make actual national perfection an unreachable goal because it is being falsely taught to exist not just in the current status quo, but on our historic status quo ante? It's always been there. Corporate America preaches Six Sigma, a set of tools and processes for constant improvement to pursue success in the world market. This process of eyes wide open self-assessment is gospel in a nation that cherishes economic productivity and all of the doors it opens for our people. Should we not then, as patriots, be doing the very same thing as we evaluate our nation and our past? Isn't lessons learned a fundamentally important procedure in the effort to survive in a constantly changing world? Six Sigma strategies seek to improve the quality of the output of a process by identifying and removing the causes of any and all defects. An honest commitment to just such a process would seem inherently necessary to become a more perfect union. The earliest European refugees to our shores aspired to create a shining city on a hill. They committed themselves to establishing a democratic nation, one that would serve as an example to the autocratic monarchies of Europe that denigrated the lives of vast numbers of people due to their religious or political beliefs. The obvious hypocrisies within that vision of America, created by the patriarchal and white supremacist realities of early American society, do complicate the reality of that time. The impulse to ignore that uncomfortable complication leads some to wish to whitewash our nation's history, to clean our children's palate when they learn, not challenge them at appropriate levels, right? But the undeniable ripples of those social injustices continue to frame the experiences of many Americans' lives today. Any movement away from an honest assessment of our past is to give up on a shared vision of an ever more perfect, if never truly perfect, union. America should unflinchingly continue to aspire to be that beacon of light on a hill for all to admire in a future that actually offers liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So, I think a lot of what Mr. Hilgendorf said is super important, because I've also participated in diversity groups at University School and Whitefish Bay High School and now Whitefish Bay Middle School. And it's because, again, having the ability to develop a comfortable conversation around race is a monumental task in and of itself. To get people to be self-aware enough in so many directions is difficult, especially when you're trying to facilitate conversations between kids. And so, I think for me, it's really about, for me to be here, there are teachers who literally, in no jest, in front of this teacher, some said, I'm nuts. Why are you gonna put yourself out there on this topic if there are people running around with hatchets? And I said, the reality is, I have always understood that, like, similar to other things, the actual quote I'm not gonna use, but I don't know that anyone knows what truth is, but you know it when you see it, right? And so, but the reality is, for me, I never have fear. I've had some difficult conversations with people that did not agree with things that I have done or lessons that I've led or things that I have, had students participate in. But I've always ended up on the right side with a better relationship with the people that came at me with those conversations because of the community I'm blessed to live in and the district I'm blessed to work for. And so, that's talking about one of the school districts in the state that we are blessed, right? We're one of the most supported, best funded. So, in all these other schools, like Mr. Hilgendorf talked about, that's not the case. And so where, I can fight the good fight in Whitefish Bay, and I've never ended up on the wrong side of things in doing that, right? But there are schools where teachers aren't in a position to fight a good fight. They're not in a position to have a multiracial organization that they can run because there's no budget. And so I am passionate about it. I'm glad and thankful that you are all here. I'm glad that there are grandparents and parents interested in what's happening. And I do think it's something that we all need to be passionate about to ensure that there is truth for kids to look at and know it when they see it. So thank you.
I want to ask the audience for some questions. I'm sure you've got them, and I'm sure they'll be usefully answered.
I've got a microphone here, and wait for me to come to you so that we can, the people online.
Well, you know, when you met this hullabaloo over CRT, let's put it in a different perspective. Does that mean in Germany they should not teach their kids the history of the Holocaust and persecution of the Jews? Or in Japan, they shouldn't talk about the atrocities committed by the Japanese army when they invaded China? I mean, the massacre at Nanking in was it 1937 or 38 when the Japanese it's unimaginable to me how people want to bury the bad stuff, sweep it under the rug. I just don't understand it. Being born in Norway under the Nazi occupation and knowing what I had to go through, don't say anything bad, don't do anything, your parents did all the talking. And it was only after I came back to the United States I found out my next door neighbor had been a sergeant in the Norwegian Nationalist Socialist Army who made up lists of Jews who had escaped Norway and went to the Swedish borders and said to the guard, here's a list of criminals wanted, please return them. I mean, it's a black dot on Norwegian history. So, I mean, we all have that, and unless we face it, we're just going to keep on repeating it.
Hi, I'm a few generations removed from the classroom. As a student, do you still, in Wisconsin and in this area, need to buy textbooks whose contents are mostly made for the Texas market because of the size of the Texas market? And are you able to teach off of the text, which kind of leads to the other question? How much does the school board, what are the guide rails for setting your curriculum in Wisconsin as a whole? Because I feel like Whitefish Bay is probably an exception to the rule when we look at our state.
So I can't speak as, that's on. I can't speak as an authority necessarily on like the rest of the state, but there are it's a very procedural process, and so and your inclination, I think you were suggesting that like when we go away from the textbook, which is much more common in like modern social studies instruction, we are constantly supplementing the textbook. I often refer to the textbook as a boring consultant. It's like, that's my running joke. It's like I pretend it's like the boring sidekick. But we do read it and we do take notes on it because the students we need to have some common backbone, right? Where and it's also at a reading level that's appropriate for the vast majority of all my students, whether, regardless of where they are on the spectrum of like performance. So, and then from there you can begin to use, supplement with primary sources, and then that's where reading ability and things can become challenging in a public school setting. So, those documents are definitely known internally. What is changing right now because of CRT and the pressure that some in the communities are putting on public schools is we are, like right now, I've got my professional learning goals and things that I do like parallel to my instructional responsibilities. But we are also rapidly, on our own volition as a district, creating what we're calling Tier 2 curriculum documents, which will make transparent, because none of us feel we have anything to hide. And we know it's social, we know we are the Wicked Witch, the social studies departments, and so, we are rapidly putting together documents where you'll, in some instances, be able to click all the way down to like my lesson plan. But in most units of study, you will in the least be able to access any document that students are going to be looking at. And again, it's not because that's not something that's being done by the district because of CRT or anything. It's because we know that transparency is always best in education. And you know, to me, it's the opposite of censorship. Let's put everything out there so that there's nothing that's unknown, so nobody feels hoodwinked, because that's when we respond with emotion. And I think that a lot of the CRT debate is coming from an emotional place. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to you and just make a comment. I agree with Cornell West, although he may agree with me on this, because I don't know who came up with it first. But I really believe, I really feel that what's happening with us, with so much of our population, is that we're adolescents. We're a very young country. We're adolescents with grown-up bodies. You know, adolescents are cowards, basically. I mean, it's groupthink, right? We sort of get an idea from one of the kids who looks more popular, and then everybody sort of follows in the step. But I think we're so controlled by fear of being different, by fear of having a voice, of being a grown-up, of standing in our own power. And we've been socialized to be fearful by the patriarchy, by the institutions, and so that's what we have now. We have a whole divided system of people that are so fear-ridden and terrified of facts, terrified of doing our own inner work, of saying, what am I so afraid of? What is the danger here? We have to do that individually, and then collectively, we can become a different country. But we have to do our own work, and many of us don't want to do it. We just fall into step with the bully or whoever else. So we're just cowards. So many of us are just pure cowards, and we have a whole legislature that are full of cowards. That's all I have to say.
You should be on the panel.
That's right.
You should run for office.
Yeah, you should run for office.
First of all, I have to say, what do you really think? Yeah. So we have national standards and we have state standards. Yep. And the state standards are way too much, even if you would be doing social studies every minute of every day. So I'm really interested in how you're taking the state standards and going into your tier 2 that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And what do you see in your, arena of districts around?
Yeah, again, my professional experience, I was at university school for 4 years, and then I've been at Whitefish Bay since, and so I'm limited. But what I can say is the state standards definitely, we're still bound to those, and so that curriculum work is already actually done. So you can see, and that's mostly tied to the textbook, as she referenced, and so you can check so many of those boxes, through like the most rudimentary level of curriculum design, which is the textbook selection and so on. And then from there, I think it's, there's other paradigms that we also use as we look at our curriculum. We don't only use the state standards. And so, but we understand that we are obligated to be connected to those documents. That documentation, I believe, is already available in the curriculum documents at Whitefish Bay, certainly at the high school. But these documents that we're putting out now, I think it's more of like at a parent level, right? Because I think all of us as teachers do understand. There's one thing the CRT crowd, if the people that are agitated, that they're not wrong about, and that is that like the schools are the community schools, and that again the families should have influence on the way those schools work. Now the trap door for I think a lot of their arguments is that those things already exist. You can go to you can go to the board meetings, you can go to the PTO, you can do these things, and we have our curriculum online. And by the way, I've had 2 experiences where I was directly impacted by someone concerned about what I was teaching and how I was teaching it. That's twice in 15 years of teaching. One of the times it did require that I change my unit design. And I think that the reality though for us is that again, we're very confident of what we put out, as teachers and as a school district. And so I think we are in a very comfortable place compared to so many districts, right, where like the fact that we even have the time to work on these documents concurrently while teaching and doing our other professional obligations is a testimony to like the amount of support we have as teachers in the district, and time, they give us professional time to do that work, which is it's time consuming and it is important, and to do it well, it's taxing with patience mostly, but.
Hi. Can you imagine being a teacher in Virginia and you want to teach the book 1619 and told you can't? And this movement is growing, as you have stated. And we live in a post-truth, post-factual world. And I really think a lot of this, I don't really think, I know a lot of this is coming from the right wing of the GOP. And that party now is basically the Trump party. They're going to win big in 2022, looks to me like, and he'll probably be our next president again. And I think that's just somewhat of a reality. And could you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that politicians know this history. I'm worried that who has the airtime? It's the CRT group, and it's a much more thoughtful response if a politician talks the way we're talking this morning about the importance of history, about the importance of diverse views, about the importance of dialogue between black and white students. I think that argument is so compelling that as a nation, we've reached a point where we need to have dialogue. This isn't about demonizing people. This is about opening up a dialogue. This is the most democratic principle you could have, that in American history, we have open discussions about our search, not our absolute certainty, but we are searching together for truth. Think about that. For the first time in American history classrooms, we are searching and have women's perspectives, blacks, Asian. This is our country. And this history discussion reflects the deepest, we're hungry for this. I know that doesn't sound like a political statement, but I think the country is hungry for dialogue. We've seen the absence of it. We can't go much further. And I hear your concerns. I think in the 2022 election, CRT will be as much an issue as Ukraine, which is scary, right? That will be an issue that will, capture people's attention. We've got to, and what Susan said, we've got to grow up. We've got to face our history, but not face it with hostility. Healing, that's what we need right now. And liberal politicians don't know the history. It's unfortunate. They know a little of the history. But when they're in a debate with other politicians, I think they're going to lose. They don't have a message. They don't have a bumper sticker. How do you have a bumper sticker saying history is complex? Put that on your car.
You'll only sell the history teachers.
History is ironic. Embrace the paradox. Vote for me. Embrace the paradox. I don't think I'll get many votes.
I will say, it's easy to point at some of the things you referenced, and certainly I agree with some of those things that you said. But there are problems with both parties and the way that the politicians, the way that elections happen, and the way that they're rewarded for what they do say and what they actually do, and the fact that it's actually not easy to hold them accountable to what they say and what they actually do, much less do we have any interest to actually try and do that. And so we let them get away with it endlessly, saying things and then doing different things, and that's both parties, and it's been going on for generations. So it's a fundamental problem with our democracy, and I think modern elections have compounded it. And talk about being a young country, modern elections, really, I guess it was I Like Ike, right, Mr. Bremer? You know, the first animated Disney political cartoon, and now our entire political arena is a cartoon. So it's amazing the way things, you know, evolve. But I want to go back to what I think is truly what keeps me up at night above everything else, is that we are in a severe teacher shortage in this country. And you know, our schools now are being attacked from the outside by groups. I don't care if they're the minority. I want you guys to hear me say, like, the schools and teachers and administrators need like supportive emails, phone calls, offers of any, you know, support. You know, call the library and media center, people who are in charge of ordering those books, and even if they're being supported, you know, make them feel support from outside and feel love, because, you know, the thing that is working is that the Republican Party has done that, what they've realized, which is what the Democrats found out with Obama, which is it's a grassroots movement. Everything is a grassroots movement. What's going to motivate the Republican voters after the loss in the election? It's going to be red meat issues, and one of them is CRT. The school board elections across this country, including in Wisconsin, were being paid for by a political think group, a Republican political think group, and, you know, Ozaki was one of them. So, and that's not to demonize them. They're playing the game, you know. And again, that goes back to, like, the nature of our political arena and the way that you get the money and get rewarded with elections. And so I guess I try to stay away from pointing fingers necessarily, because the people that are pointing fingers right now are playing the game. I guess I would agree with Mr. Hilgendorf better. And so, you know, the voices we do hear, even though I'm confident as a teacher they are the minority, certainly they have our full attention. And they have schools full attention. And, you know, how would I feel to be a teacher in Virginia? I know what truth is, and I teach towards truth, and it would probably get me straight into trouble. So, and it's really unfortunate. And I know that there's going to be lots of tragic stories that come out of those states where they put teachers in that position, because teachers are truth tellers, at least the ones that have impacted me, and there's a lot of them. So, you know, I really feel for those teachers, and I'm glad you thought of that.
No, I'm actually talking, although I might. My interest is encouraging the audience.
It's not a promise.
I could talk. Do we have any from the people abroad? Okay.
First of all, thank you for your advocacy for teachers. I so appreciate that.
Yeah, here.
I really do. Thank you. I'd like, even though I'm intrigued with the bumper sticker that you referred to, Mark, as teaching the paradox, I would like you to give some practical application of how do you teach a paradox as opposed to dualistic thinking. I think that is at the heart of a lot of things that we do or don't do, is that we are dualistic thinkers. Paradox intrigues me. How do you teach it?
Wow.
In 30 words or less.
Yeah. Can I pass?
You have more experience than I do.
I'll give an example, I guess, is the best way to answer. The paradox of Jim Crow is that it was a bad experience for blacks and a good experience for whites. In my Whitefish Bay history class, I actually learned that there was no black voice, that they were just buried and suppressed, but for good reasons. That simplistic way of looking at history denies paradox. I think the paradox is that in spite of a lack of education, black Southerners were able to push for public schools for white and black students, land reform for white and black people, tax reform for white and black people. Most people would think they were bitter, they were angry, they wanted revenge. The non-dualistic view is that in spite of the oppression, in spite of the lack of dignity, they chose a higher road. They modeled for white America, for white Southerners, what it's like to be a civilized, humanized culture. That is my definition of paradox. Everything you would have expected didn't happen. Everything that you expected. and they cared about making connections. They walked miles and miles to find family members after the Civil War. That's what they wanted. They didn't pick up a gun to shoot their slaveholder. That wasn't in their imagination. They wanted to bring a humanity to the South. And they deeply cared about this country. Another paradox. Former slaves loving America, wanting its greatest potential to live up to the words of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. That's not expected. To take such a high road when they could have taken such a low road. Wouldn't that inspire white kids too? That in spite of oppression, in spite of what you've had in your own life, I mean, keep it personal. White students don't have easy lives either. But in a history classroom, they can be inspired to think that people, not blacks, not whites, were resilient, resourceful, imaginative, forgiving. How often in American history class is forgiveness taught? I'm in church, I can talk about it, right? Father Seth can talk about it, but these students, for the first time, might be embracing a deep forgiveness. It's got to be liberating. But Francie, I think a dualistic view of the world would never get at these questions. Maybe part of it's irony too. How ironic that blacks brought new faith to the Christian message. There's another paradox. Malcolm X called Christianity the religion of oppression. Martin Luther King called it the religion of liberation. It's an interesting debate. How can you be a Christian when all those Christian slaveholders treated you so badly? Well, I'm going to breathe new life into Christianity. I'm going to make it really true. I'm going to make Jesus walk in the South. That's what King said, Jesus walking in the South. Those paradoxes are beautiful. The unexpected, the unintended. So, you know, I know I sound like I'm so hopeful, but I do think students are just hungry for what I'm talking about. I've seen it for 40 years. I've seen it. They walk out of those classrooms with a whole burden lifted.
I guess I would add too, one thing that I think traditional teaching of history does is it limits the individuals in history as well that we're looking at it, and we kind of lock them into, here's what Dr. King believed. And really what you're talking about is beliefs you're pulling from various documents over a period of time, and it takes away from the evolution of the thinking of the people, and it takes away that humanity, you know, and the fact that they were human and fallible. And I think that that's one of the things that as well, that it's the paradox of the individual person, the evolution of Lincoln as a politician, and the way that his thinking around race evolved over historical time. I mean, that's a fascinating story of Lincoln that only the nerdiest of nerdy historian and history teachers, you know. But I do agree with Mr. Hilgendorf. Like, if you're able to distill it down, like I had teachers do for me and I try to do for students, it is what they want. Then again, it goes back to, I don't know what truth is, but I know it when I see it. And as you teach longer and longer, you become better at trying to help kids see enough of a spectrum that they can identify that when you put that all together, that is what truth is. It's having the knowledge and perspective to empathize and be able to make a better decision next time, regardless of what it's about. And that can be in your own life, or it can be, you know, parallel to one of these stories if you're a powerful person in the political arena. But I know they're not reading history books.
So I am not a history nerd. I am quite the opposite. I found history to be profoundly boring, and I probably doodled way more than I wrote down any notes. So it's very daunting when you talk about all this stuff that's uploaded and the documents are out there, and that is fantastic. I'm a huge proponent of transparency, but I think, where do I begin? And I ask that question because I have an almost 2-year-old grandson, so he's coming up. I gotta have real conversations with him. And it's not gonna be coming from the weakness of my history lessons and the deficit of that. So my question is, I'm sure there are gazillions of things to read. What would you suggest to a grandparent?
Oh man, you have a suggestion on? I'm gonna think for a minute.
Any book to read? Any book. Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And a superficial reading of that book would say, oh, he's just angry. He's really upset. A deeper reading of that book is that he thinks a dialogue has to happen among whites and blacks. He wrote this in 1963, and he said we can have political discussions, sociological discussions, but we need to talk face to face. And if we don't do that, the fire next time. I mean, it's a profound statement.
I have a teacher answer. I'm a middle school teacher answer. I honestly would say start with the teacher. If you're trying to support a child, as the child goes through, I think it's extremely important that if parents want, especially when I get to history that can be upsetting. So if there's going to be, lynching statistics and even potentially images of lynchings in when I taught high school history, I did get parental approval for that. But it's not because I felt like I was doing something that I needed approval for. It's because I wanted the student to know that the parent understood that you're going to school today and you are going to be in an uncomfortable situation and it is going to be challenging and you might feel upset, but that is a human reaction. And so, the humane thing to do for your students is to ensure that they have receptive adults at home who are prepared to talk to them that dinner that night, about so tell me about school today. I mean, we all say it, but if at school today your child was exposed to something to that level of that dark underbelly of our history, you can kind of be prepared to have that conversation, and you don't need to read Baldwin or other books if you're not going to because you don't love history, but you can be really informed on the child, on a level of that child, and I think that's really important.
There was a couple questions up here, and then I'll come back over to that table. And I'll come back to you. I'll be right back. Here you go.
My question has to do with transparency and a couple other things that have been touched on that are interwoven, but kind of at a real basic or floor level. This morning on a social media thing, I saw that Tucker Carlson suggested cameras in the classroom because of this. But then what followed was an essay by a teacher who said, I have a counterintuitive answer to this, and I welcome the cameras because this is what you'll see. Facts taught, history, on and on. I don't have a quote from it, but it was just wonderful about how, what I took away from it is how the kids learn and how they're engaged and talk to one another, how creative they are, how bright they are, all the great things that go on in the classroom and how it would be good to have cameras there. So I say that partly in that praise of teachers. I think that's right. But I am curious what you think of, has that ever been talked about, cameras in the classroom?
So, I mean, look, I'm not hiding anything. I got an open door policy with my administrators and everyone else. I've always said, come on in, that's fine. On an entirely separate level, I don't think we need to be getting our children used to having cameras on them, monitoring what we are doing. That is something in a democracy that should be, that's antithetical to everything that we are. To suggest that because we're not doing anything wrong, we shouldn't care about the protection of our own liberty, it would be contradictory, by the way, to even, I hope, most of the current Republican Party. So, that notion to me, it's not a question of educational correctness. It's on a level of really, where are we going? What are we doing? Are we going to put them in law? Are we going to put it in lawyers' offices too? And by the way, should we, maybe we should put cameras in the politicians' offices and all over everywhere they go, so we can hear everything that they say, because I think it would be a lot better television.
Comment and then a question. My comment is, I don't want to diminish our emphasis on black relations, but let's not forget the yellow race, the red race, the brown race, and all the others. Question: how important do you feel it is to explain what drives people to do what they do. The influence of culture, the influence of economics, the drive for so-called progress. How important is that?
In terms of your first comment, I recommend a book by Ronald Takaki called A Different Mirror. And he looks at Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans. It's about 400 pages, so it's a challenge. But I used that book in my history teaching in Milton, and I covered so much history through that book. There aren't many who have been as ambitious as Ronald Takaki to put this together, A Different Mirror. And your second question about progress, would you say?
Yeah. What drives people to do what they do?
Yeah, what drives people to do? Well, Susan talked about fear. I think we've had a politics of fear for a while, and we don't quite know where it's going. Now, President Biden said he wanted to restore the soul of America, and people who like Biden felt comfortable with that language. But I'm aware that many people think a politician shouldn't be talking about restoring the soul of a country, that's out of bounds for politicians. They should be talking about economics, social issues, war and peace. Some people felt that Biden was almost like a chaplain for the nation, given his years of experience, his wisdom based on all the losses he faced. He almost sounded king-like, that America needs to restore its soul. I don't mind that language, but I think it's got to be beyond that too, and we have to change our behavior. We can be inspired by that language, but unless we change and really start having dialogues that do restore the soul of this country, those words will be not as impactful. But I thought it was very interesting that someone running for president could use that kind of language, restore the soul of this country. I don't know if we'll see that again right now. But with the Ukraine situation, World War III talk, it seems awfully distant, doesn't it, when Biden a year ago said we'll restore the soul of our country? I know a lot of people were inspired by that he was resonating with people. And now a year later, could he run again and say, I'm going to restore the soul of America? Probably not. So I'm not fully answering your question, but I do think we need a new language. Politicians need a new language. It can't be the same old. We've got a new language for teaching history. Same thing. Yeah.
I want to make sure that everybody who's had their hand up gets a chance. We really only have about time for two more questions. And then I want to give Jim a chance to give us any thoughts that you have as kind of summary. So, okay.
Because American history has been so racialized, and different people and different groups of people have been treated differently because of their race, is there any hope, in your view, that we could even have a shared American past, a shared American identity? For example, as a white woman, I would feel uncomfortable like saying that the many contributions that Black Americans have made is like part of my history. And I could see how it could be problematic for someone of a different race to identify with the Declaration of Independence because it excluded people who were not white. So again, is there any hope in your view of having a shared sense of American identity and past because of all the racialized atrocities that have happened in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the instantly as a teacher of U.S. history, I certainly always looked at it as like the evolution of the promise of America. And so you look at what there's the starting point, right? And as you said, if you were a woman or any collection of races beyond Caucasian, at the starting line, you weren't in the race. And so, from there, you look at all of the reform movements, whether they be like religious-based, the persecution that like all immigrants have always faced, right? I mean, Irish and Germans were hated as much as anyone else, prior to the arrival of large numbers of Chinese on the West Coast, and then the ire turned to them in the labor movement on the West Coast. And so, there is this, it's the promise that America put down on paper. It's what we've always tried to hold ourselves to, and it's the fact that, am I worried about Virginia and the exclusion of the book, and do I fear for our kids, if they're not getting to complete it? Yeah, I do it. But at the same time, what America, that common bond that we've shown over time is, like, the lies will fall apart, right? I mean, the propaganda will fall apart. It always does, because, even though there are autocratic tendencies within certain people who are in power right now, the reality is that the will of the people, the American people, the vast majority of us, I think modern media has really screwed it all up in the way that we kind of surge and rise together. But the reality is that blowback will be more than they're going to be able to take. The unfortunate reality is that there might be decades of painful history between now and then. And certainly I know a lot of you as grandparents are probably terribly worried for your 2-year-olds coming up into the school system in an environment where we're surrounded by this. But I think, like I said, push love out towards and support towards your teachers that are fighting the good fight. Push love and support towards like this kind of a meeting. I'm really thankful to have been given a voice. I've never participated in a panel like this, so I'm very appreciative of that. But I do think that we have a common bond. To suggest that we don't is unpatriotic. Period. And how do we debate the wall and build the wall? And if we're a nation of immigrants, the reality is that we have to also stop demonizing other. And so, we can't get dragged. They're setting the stage for these debates, and they're drawing us into having the debate the way they want us to, and we're then predictable, and we're losing the debate. And I think that what we have to do is have this clear vision, like, we've talked about a little bit about just having that clarity of knowing what our truth is, and to me, that's our truth. We can always do better. We always have. So let's look at it from that perspective and understand, have we been terrible? Yes. We still are sometimes. I am. So, that's what I look for.
I really want to kind of wrap it up. We're really coming up on the noon time. So, Jim, I want to give you an opportunity to say a few things. So we'll close our questions down, but just give us some of your thoughts.
This isn't my show. I really want to feature these two fellas. But I will say this much. One of the mottos I had in teaching history for a very long time was teach the conflicts. And what I meant by that was the students were expected to read the documents, to figure out the arguments on all sides. For example, during the 1850s, one of my specialties, you had all kinds of different factions fighting like crazy over the political future of the country and whether Lincoln should be elected. You had the pacifist abolitionists, the war abolitionists. They didn't really develop into high war abolitionists until the war started. But you had debates in the South, believe it or not, between people who thought slavery was probably going to last only a little while longer and we ought to start making arrangements. You had a lot more people in the South who just hated any abolitionist talk whatsoever. But to get down those arguments and make sure we heard them all was what I did with the students, without judging until we were finished. Now, to do that now and apply it to our current discussion, I kept thinking, how can I distill the best possible form of the argument of the people objecting to the teaching of the modern the view we've heard here today, the view that us young people, right, want to teach in the colleges and high schools. And I think that their best worry, or the worry that's most creditable and enunciatable, is this. Many of us had, and I certainly did at Ann Arbor High School, teachers who featured the best values of America in the Constitution and the Declaration, held them up really high, then looked at exactly what really happened to see the dispersions or the divergence between the best ideals and what actually happened, and then point the students to the movements, the uprisings, the rebellions, based on those best values that then started to hopefully fix the problems, or at least address the problems. What I hear sometimes amongst some of the people who aren't terribly articulate about what CRT could possibly mean is a worry that we're polluting the values, we're not focusing on the values, we're looking at, for example, who wrote the values into the Constitution and saying, oh, well, they were slaveholders, they must be wrong, which is, of course, a fallacy. It's the ad hominem fallacy. It isn't who says something that makes it right and wrong. It's whether it's right or wrong. And the students were expected to learn that and to try to address both sides of each argument, making their best argument apparent, and then make their own decision. Who do they want to be? Where do they want to stand? Where should we stand today on similar issues? So I do that just as a tiny tribute, or at least an allowance for the people who are objecting to the way we teach today and saying maybe they've got that much that we should listen to and think about. And perhaps maybe we should consider being a little careful to be positive whenever we can be about the best values of the country, such that people hear us doing that and don't think we're simply anti-American.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to all of our panelists, Mark and Scott. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out today. I'd like to just close in a prayer. Let us pray. Lord our God, we thank you for gathering us this morning. We thank you for this time that we have shared. We thank you for the wisdom and knowledge that has been presented, not only by our panelists, but also by the members here gathered. We thank you, Lord, for teachers, and we ask that you put your hand upon them. Always be with them, and help bring more teachers to our schools. We thank you for our schools and for all that they do for our children. And bless our kids. Lord, it is in your name that we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you again.